Hi, my name is Isa Garcia, and as a bilingual individual, to me, it's really important to be able to see how being bilingual has an effect on individuals and their cognitive development, as well as their cognitive control. And that's why today I'll be going over two articles that show those differences and show how being bilingual has a benefit. Um, so the two articles that I'll be going over are the bilingual effects on cognitive and linguistic development, the role of language, cultural background, and education, as well as the effects of habitual code switching and bilingual language production on cognitive control. So this first study really wanted to emphasize on the questions of what effect of code switching and language proficiency have on cognitive shifting, and how does code switching lead to better task switching and nonverbal cognitive control. So they want to be able to discover and look into how being bilingual and being able to switch from language to language or from those different situations, how does that affect how much control you really have over it and your efficiency between that task switching, how fast or how slow it is. And they moved moved to this and wanted to pursue this because of previous research that showed that bilingual children have faster and more accurate nonverbal tasks. And this previous research also showed that cultural influences should be taken into consideration. So they wanted to see really how culture matters for cognitive skills and whether the differences in cultures and differences in language really play a part. So they believed and hypothesized that bilingual groups will perform equally with the other groups on nonverbal tasks, but those with similar bilingual languages like Spanish and English bilinguals will perform better on verbal tasks compared to those who speak English and Chinese just because of how different the languages are. So this study consisted of 104 participants, 26 English monolinguals, 30 Chinese English bilinguals, 28 French English bilinguals, 20 Spanish English bilinguals. Um, and this was a quasi-experimental design because they already spoke these languages. They were split up into different tasks. So there was three verbal tasks, which consisted of a PPVT, receptive vocabulary test, the CLEF standardized language test, and the WUGS test that tested grammatical rules. So they were split up again, depending on the language group and how similar the languages were. And then they were measured within those verbal and nonverbal tasks based off of reaction time and accuracy. So here we can see the different tests, the PVT, the CLEP, and the WEGS test. So we can actually see that for the PPVT, English monolinguals had the highest score, indicating strong English vocabulary. And then we can see that Spanish was actually really close because this is the most similar, Spanish is the most similar language to English. For the CLEP test, we see that again, English monolinguals, forgive me, um, had the highest score, but the Spanish bilinguals were a close um, second. And for this WUGS test, we see that the Spanish bilinguals actually had the highest score, so they're able to grammatically apply new rules more efficiently. For this nonverbal task, which was the color switching task, essentially they had to identify um, whether whichever stimuli the researcher wanted, whether it was a color or a shape. For example, they were presented with a red circle. They had to identify what the whatever stimuli was. So if they said what color is this, then they would say red or just circle. So here we can see that um, nonverbal processing speeds were very different. Um, Spanish bilinguals were slightly faster at nonverbal tasks, suggesting they had more efficiency because of how similar the languages are. So you see when they were not switching, but or when they were switching, and you see that overall the reaction times were a lot faster. So for the second one, the second study, the main question that the researchers wanted to address was, does frequent code switching lead to better performance on cognitive shifting and inhibitory control? So essentially, just trying to see whether cognitive shifting, how efficient was it, and if it was or wasn't, how much control they actually had. And they pursued this based on previous research as well, in which they found that using two languages and frequent switching requires different levels of cognitive control. So they wanted to see if that was really true and really how it would apply for bilingual individuals. And then they also went off of how bilingual people cognitive control adapts depending on how much they use those second languages. And just in general, how bilingual people manage their resources when they are switching those languages. They hypothesize that bilingual people who spend time in those single language places will perform worse just based on exposure within both nonverbal and verbal tasks. So these are actually really similar, the two studies, because they both have verbal and nonverbal tasks. Um, so this study design consisted of 31 Mandarin English bilinguals. Um, they had their verbal task and the nonverbal task. So this one was just a picture naming switching task. So name the picture and whatnot. And then the nonverbal one was exactly the same as the one from the previous study. The only difference was they had single repeated switch task, meaning they would just speak one single language. They would repeat that language again, or they switch the languages. And again, similar like the other tasks, they are measured on reaction time and accuracy. So for this one, essentially, we are able to see, so this is what I mean by single. So they would speak either English here and then English again, and then English the first time and then English again. So they repeat that language, or they switch it. So it would be English to Spanish or vice versa. Um, so we can actually see here that those who are speaking the single languages are actually a lot faster. They're equally as accurate with when speaking Chinese. When they're not, um, there's really not much of a difference. For the nonverbal tasks, we see that these are for the single, repeated, and the switch, there actually is a really big difference when you're switching tasks between, when you're switching the languages between the tasks. There's a large delay, and although accuracy is pretty equal, just off by a little bit, there's a really big delay within that switching. And even when repeating it, it it is a little delayed, but it's not super delayed. Um, so were the hypotheses supported? Yes, essentially they were for both studies. Um, Both of them found that there's a lot of correlation between task switching and language switching that really plays an effect on cognitive control. Uh, we found within both of these that bilingualism actually boosts that executive control. So there's more control, seeing that people are able to switch tasks faster. And even though they're switching from one language to another, and there may be little delays or gaps, that it's still more effective than just speaking that one language. Um, and then there's just overall more cognitive benefits with being bilingual. Um, and just language switching really enhances that general cognitive control and brain flexibility since there's so much going on and you're able to switch from one thing to another, but still having that control. And these are my references. Thank you very much.